The fight is on to modernize science in America, and that means the National Institutes of Health, NIH, must change. How PETA is applying the pressure. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil, Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights. Brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, protesters at animal experimenters' neighborhoods, plus 2 lawsuits pressuring NIH to change. The fight to save the lives of animals in labs continues in earnest as PETA applies pressure on NIH, the National Institutes of Health. Just this past week, protesters were at the home of a lifelong vivisector with picket signs alerting her neighbors of the kinds of things she did to animals. But more significantly, PETA filed 2 lawsuits against NIH. As reported in the journal Science, the charge is that NIH is blocking animal rights comments from official government NIH sites, a violation of First Amendment rights. PETA alleges that NIH has set filters on its Facebook and Instagram pages to block words and phrases such as #StopAnimalTesting, PETA, and cruel. PETA is joined by the Animal Legal Defense Fund and the Knight First Amendment Institute. Some other words that are blocked. Words like animal, mice, hamster, marmosets, monkey, primate, stop, hurt, torture, and even experiment. The second lawsuit is even more groundbreaking, a first-of-its-kind lawsuit that sues NIH Director Francis Collins, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the HHS Secretary Javier Becerra. It alleges that sepsis experiments on animals, acknowledged by NIH itself to be bad models to fight human disease, abuses the agency's discretion and fails the overall mandate of the agency to improve human health. Instead, billions of dollars are wasted overall to fund experimentation that is among the most hideously gruesome experiments done, and also the most useless, as they lead to zero advances in sepsis among humans. Dr. Emily Trunnell is a PETA senior scientist, a one-time animal experimenter. She switched to become an ethical scientist at PETA. She talks about the real need to find an answer to sepsis, but the path does not include animal experimentation. What is sepsis? Dr. Trunnell explains on the PETA Podcast.
So sepsis is the body's extreme response to an infection. So can happen, let's say you get in a car accident or you have pneumonia or some other issue and the infection spreads and the body's immune system overreacts to that. It's a very painful condition. It affects almost 2 million American adults and kills almost 300,000 people in the U.S. each year.
And so when you say it's the body's reaction, that means something happens in an accident, say an infection would be like I start bleeding.
Right. Sepsis refers to when, say, you give the example of an accident, say a car accident, and you get some internal bleeding in that car accident. The body, your immune system ramps up to try to fight the inflammation and the infection that's happening where that injury is. But sepsis occurs when that becomes systemic. So it starts happening in other organs that aren't affected. It starts happening throughout the body, and it can lead to what people may have heard more of as like shock or septic shock, where the body's, the blood pressure plummets. Your body just can't handle the level of inflammation, and everything's kind of going awry.
And so a lot of people might have heard the term, septic shock or sepsis during the pandemic, because a lot of patients were going into this, into sepsis or dying of sepsis, right?
That's right. So in a normal year, sepsis will kill like 270,000, close to 300,000 Americans. And that number could be higher because, like you said, during the pandemic, people who are hospitalized for COVID sometimes get sepsis and die. I actually have a family friend that just happened to. And that's part of that is because sepsis is known to cause pneumonia. And pneumonia is one illness that can lead to sepsis.
And so, given that, and given, we're still in the pandemic now as we speak, isn't it a good thing to look into how sepsis works? I mean, isn't that a justification?
We desperately need treatments and cures for sepsis. There are no good treatments for sepsis that exist. It's really physicians are using antibiotics, trying to keep people's blood pressure stable, things like that, the same things they've been doing for decades. And the number of people that still die from sepsis every year without any new developments coming from the research community to help them, it's absurd. So we need to be studying sepsis, but we need to be doing it in ways that are relevant to humans that have the chance of actually helping humans.
All right. So the argument then is that, we need sepsis experiments, or we need sepsis research, but we need the right kind. So what is wrong with the kind of animal research that they're doing now, if it could lead possibly? Because there are people who might have had a relative or a loved one die of sepsis. They might be saying, aren't we in the realm of any kind of action could help? Any kind of action leading, might give us good information? Or is it pretty moot that if you're looking with animals, another species, it has no relevance at all to human beings?
The studying mice and other animals, you're studying a completely different condition. And this is something that NIH has admitted. So the NIH putting millions of dollars into sepsis experiments on mice and other animals, that's taking money away from other sepsis research that could actually benefit humans. That's completely diverting that from what might be helpful.
That's what they continue to do.
And that's why we're suing them.
Well, tell me about that 2013 landmark study that said that really revealed that. I mean, 2013, that's 8 years ago. And hasn't it sunk in that if this landmark study showed, I mean, it takes a while, I know, for things to change, but how does that strike you? The 2013 study comes out saying.
So the 2013 study that you mentioned, it was a huge paper that came out, like 39 researchers from many respected institutions across the US. It showed that when it comes to the genes that we use to respond to sepsis, humans and mice use completely different genes. And so when we're talking about the type of medicines that we develop now that are focused on what genes do and how things work molecularly in the body, that difference really matters. And they pretty much said it's close to random, matching what happens in a mouse versus what happens in a human. So studying those things in mice, it makes absolutely no sense.
So what did Francis Collins say to all that?
Francis Collins wrote in his director's blog after that study came out that no wonder 150 drugs that were developed in experiments on mice and other animals ended up failing in human trials. There are completely different conditions, sepsis in other animals versus sepsis in humans. And this was in 2013, right after the paper came out, that Francis Collins wrote that, and NIH acknowledged this huge problem. And still in that time, I mean, even just this fiscal year, NIH has funded $11 million in new sepsis experiments to do the exact same thing that failed for the 150 drugs that were developed 8 years ago. So it's nonsensical. They keep throwing good money after bad.
Well, doesn't the NIH do a kind of assessment of what they've done and how effective they are? Do they have to wait for an entity like PETA to come sue it, or can it just say, oh, well, I mean, it sounds like they already kind of know that the experiments they do or the research they do on sepsis doesn't work. what isn't there something internal that says, oh, well, we better not do these things, or well, what does it take?
You would think that kind of thing would happen. And it's really testament to how NIH thinks. Francis Collins had also said, well, maybe we need to try to find out why the mouse are different, why the mice respond differently when they have sepsis versus what happens when humans have sepsis. And it's like, you don't study Alzheimer's to try to figure out why someone has diabetes. It's nonsensical. And it really speaks to the fact that Francis Collins panders to animal experimenters. And that's what he cares about, is keeping those people happy and not necessarily promoting the best science.
Now, this study comes out in 2013 that you referred to, that we've talked about here. Sometimes they're one-offs. Sometimes, you can't replicate it. Have the same results been shown in other subsequent papers? I mean, is it?
Well, the 2013 study, although it was huge, it was a landmark study, and there was a lot of media surrounding it and a lot of attention to it. It was not the first study to say these things. There have been decades of papers that have written about how sepsis experiments on other animals do not replicate human sepsis. All of the myriad of differences between not only the animal's biology, but the experimental conditions in which the sepsis in animals is induced, and how that's all different from the human situation. That's why this case, to file a lawsuit against NIH for funding an area of research, sepsis is an obvious area of research where the evidence has stacked up for so many years against the use of animals that it just doesn't make sense. The 2013 study, all of the other studies, it doesn't make sense why NIH would keep funding those.
What other ways could be more effective in coming up with ways to deal with sepsis?
There are so many research methods that we have to be able to study sepsis in humans. And importantly, these methods are based in human biology and not the biology of mice and other animals. So one area that has a lot of interest from physicians is the use of human genome data and looking at data from patients that actually have sepsis, and being able to create profiles for these patients, look at their genetic data, gather all of the wealth of information that we're able to these days to try to determine what types of treatments help certain patients with certain symptoms of sepsis and certain comorbidities, other things that may be happening in their situation. So that's something that is kind of just coming up, and that physicians that we've spoken to think, this is the way that we need to be going for sepsis. These are physicians who treat patients with sepsis. There are many other methods as well, including in vitro experiments that use human cells, including cells that have been donated non-invasively from sepsis patients, human organs and organ systems on what we call organs on chips, which I know listeners of this podcast will have heard of before.
For the benefit of those who may not have gotten to that podcast episode where we talked on what is organ on a chip. What is organ on a chip, and how could that help and be more beneficial than the tons of money they're spending on sepsis research?
So an organ on a chip is a small device about the size of a computer memory stick, and it's lined with human cells and made with these specific pressure environments that mimic the human body. And the cells on these chips develop in ways that are almost undistinguishable from the way the cells develop and look and function in the human body. So, for example, scientists have developed a lung on a chip that can actually breathe just like a human lung would. And in sepsis, this could be useful because, as we mentioned earlier, sepsis often results from pneumonia and other diseases that infect the lungs, like COVID and other respiratory diseases. So So sepsis and the causes for sepsis can be studied in these organs on chips, and even to study, how sepsis affects the body as a whole system. Some scientists are even able to, link these different organ chips together. So you can have the lung on a chip and intestine on a chip and other things like that.
Intestine on a chip. Oh, well, so, and all this without animals. You're dealing with humans.
Right. So the cells are human cells. So they're based in human physiology, human genetics, which is just completely eliminates the entire problem of having to jump from one species to another, which we've seen has been the major hindrance in sepsis research.
And then along with that issue, sort of, put aside, I imagine this might be a little less expensive than spending the millions of dollars it is now being spent on the useless research.
When you're spending money on experiments, like I just said, $11 million alone this fiscal year spent on experiments on mice, that's money out the window. It's going to be a savings simply because you're not spending all that money that's just wasted. And animal experiments and the things that are done in these animal experiments are expensive.
Yeah, and then of course there's the torture on the animals.
Exactly. Sepsis is, as I mentioned earlier, sepsis is extremely painful. So to induce sepsis in animals, experimenters a lot of times will perform a technique called cecal ligation and puncture. And what that means is essentially that they cut the animal's abdomen open and they puncture their intestines with a needle and then sew them back up so that the bacteria from their intestines will leak out into their abdomen and cause sepsis. They'll also do things like inject them with toxins directly. They will make what they call a bacterial slurry, where they take fecal contents from different animals and mix them together, and then they make an animal inhale them or get injected with them. But all this results in horrific pain. Animals become so sick that eventually they can't even move. They get fever, chills, diarrhea, shock, organ failure. They have difficulty breathing, and eventually they die in every case. So it's really, the types of experiments, when you read about them, it's like a horror movie. It's not what you think about when you think about, promising science.
But this is part of the work. And is it that some of these people may be addicted to meting out this kind of torture?
That may be the case for some people. I don't think it's the case for the majority of people who do these things. I myself once experimented on animals, and I did so because I was under the impression that what I was doing would be somehow beneficial to human health and for the greater good. And unfortunately, that's the brainwashing that happens when you're in the field of biology a lot of the time.
And so, well, talk about that for a second. You saw the light. What did it for you, and what I imagine if more and more people came out and said, "Oh, these." The facts are there, right? The studies are there showing that the tests don't work, but it seems like the protests have to come from inside among the scientists. And you were a scientist on the inside, and you saw the ridiculousness and the ineffectiveness of these tests. What do you think is going to take other people on the inside to see these tests for what they are, and then to say, no, I'm not going to do it?
I think it will be a number of things. I think the more scientists who do speak up, the less it becomes a taboo thing to talk about, which it kind of is, talking about the ethics of using animals. It's just kind of, you're told, well, no, this is what we do. This is what we have to do. This is what we're supposed to do. And bringing up other things into the discussion is frowned upon. So it's going to take a normalization of compassion in science, which we really need. You want scientists Scientists are trying to heal people, trying to help us learn how the world works, how our bodies work. You want compassionate people in that field. You don't want them to leave because they think, oh, I'm not cut out for science because I don't want to hurt animals. But it'll also take, it will take agencies like NIH saying, no, we're not going to give you, $400,000 to do this horrible sepsis experiment on mice. Don't you know they don't work? And it will take a different incentive strategy in science. Part of the reason experiments like these continue is because universities who get the grants can skim enormous sums of money right off the top of them and use that money for whatever they want to do. And the scientists are, pushed to, keep getting the grants, keep publishing papers so you can get more grants. And it doesn't really foster the kind of atmosphere that you want in science to be able to focus on, what's working and what's not.
Yeah. And is this a generational thing between, say, you're fairly young scientist? Is this a generational thing between a new era of scientists versus the past?
I think it certainly is. 50 years ago, we didn't have the same technologies that we do now. Had we been investing in them then, we may have them and more by now and sooner. But older scientists have been trained primarily, biologists primarily trained in using animals for experiments. And so, people who are later in their careers may think, oh, I don't know about these new methods, and I've already set my lab up this way, and I know about all these things. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing because it's what I'm comfortable with. I just won't pay attention to any of that other stuff. And then, it's kind of human nature. It's hard to change. But when there are, hundreds of thousands of human lives, millions of animal lives, and millions of dollars at stake, you really have to say at some point, no, you have to. You have to change.
Yeah, but it's funny that it boils down to something as simple and as personal as, I've been doing this so long, I don't really feel like changing. Really, it's a human thing.
We're all guilty of that in one way or another. But that's why we have rules in society and other things to tell us when it's time to move on.
And so that's the virtue of a lawsuit. If PETA should win, it didn't take a lawsuit for you to change. You changed on your own personally.
When I was considering what I might do in my career, when I realized I didn't want to keep hurting and killing animals in the way that I've been doing, I didn't know about all of the non-animal methods that existed and how to get training to do those things. I considered other career paths. But when I learned about the science team that PETA has, it really kind of opened my world up to see, I can be a scientist, help humans and help animals, the best of all those worlds. But because I was, insulated among people who used animals, I didn't know that there were all of these resources and all of this other science out there. And that's something PETA is actually pushing the NIH to do is, part of our research modernization deal, where we want NIH to help, train young scientists in these better methods, because those are really going to be the methods of the future. We're not going to keep using animals forever. And the sooner people can be trained to use human-based, human-relevant science, that'll be better for everyone, for their careers, for everyone in the long run.
Yeah. And you made the switch and you found a life in science. And do you ever think about, well, what would have happened if you just stayed and just went on the path that your mentors showed you in science?
I don't like to think about it. I tend to think I would be extremely depressed. I know that when I did have to do those things, especially on days where we had to euthanize a lot of animals at the end of a study, it was just, there was an extreme stress and depression that I didn't really put together where it came from until later. So I don't like to think about that because I don't think that would be good. I don't think it's good for people's psyches.
Well, but you've done the right thing, and now you're trying to help others. Recently PETA gave an award to Dr. John Gluck out of the University of New Mexico, who is a big proponent for ethics in science, and he describes himself now as a bioethicist. I guess it's not too late he shows it's not too late for older scientists to see the light.
John Gluck is an incredibly brilliant and wonderful man. I've had the fortune of being able to meet him and talk with him in person. And you're right. I mean, he had a whole laboratory set up to use primates. He was trained in the lab of Harry Harlow, the infamous Harry Harlow, who did maternal deprivation experiments, and he set a lab up to do the same types of things with monkeys. And through his career, and he was successful, he came to realize that he could no longer be a part of it, and he had to speak up for those animals. And it's just incredibly inspiring. So it's not too late for anybody.
And it's certainly not too late for NIH when it comes to sepsis research.
It's never too late, especially for people who are dying in the hospital right now of sepsis. They should not waste a second longer.
Dr. Emily Trunnell, Senior Scientist in the Laboratory Investigations Division at PETA, on the lawsuit PETA filed against NIH to stop useless sepsis experiments. Just a couple of the fronts that PETA is fighting NIH, trying to get them to modernize science in America. For more on that, go to PETA.org. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA Podcast. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or see my blog at AMOK.com, or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.